keep doing daily videos on YouTube, I need to raise my Patreon and Subscribe Star income to a grand total of $200 a month. So if you're so inclined, help a chap out. Zang. Shoo, you gelatinous bastard. Shoo, shoo, shoo. Today, we're going to talk about the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Yes, it's the Sword Coast. Again. I'm not sure why this is such a popular area. I've got a few ideas, but I'm not entirely sure. But a lot of the material for D&D over the years seems to be utterly fixated on the Sword Coast, and this is particularly true of the more modern material. There's a meme that goes around constantly on D&D Facebook that the Sword Coast is the Remembered Realms and everywhere else is the Forgotten Realms, because this is all we ever seem to talk about. It's a constant retread. But that also means that it's quite heavy with lore, which means a 160-page book, much of which isn't actually lore and so on about the area, seems a bit thin compared to, say, Explorer's Guide to Wildermount, which was about twice as many pages. They really should be looking to develop other areas. And this is neither a complete source book. I would say the 3rd edition Guide to Faerun is probably the best one. Nor is it a particularly in-depth book on the Sword Coast. It seems to not exactly waste a lot of space, but to use a lot of space on things that you aren't necessarily looking for when you come looking for this. And quite honestly, there are online wikis and guides to Faerun and the Forgotten Realms that are far more useful and effective than this book is, and probably already incorporate a lot of the information from this book. I suppose the fixation on the Sword Coast is because it lines up with a lot of the areas that have been used in various computer games and other media over the years, right? So Baldur's Gate is in this area, Neverwinter is in this area, Icewind Dale is in this area, and so on. And what Wizards seems to be doing with some of their supplements lately is something I actually approve of, though they don't really do it here, in that they release adventures, mini campaigns really, with properly suggested levels and so on, but they also put other material with it. So if you want to know more about the Frozen North and so on, you would buy Rime of the Frost Maiden, and that's not just the adventure, but it is also a lot of information and lore on the area, which makes that book more useful past just the adventure. But if you're just there for the lore and the geography and everything, the adventure can feel like a bit of a waste. I think it's because they're not selling it as they're not selling it as a lore book with an adventure. They're selling it as an adventure and not necessarily playing up the lore aspect that's there. Adding value to adventure books is always good, because adventure books don't tend to sell that well. But if you're not really presenting it as a lore book, as a guide to the area, people who want that are less likely to pick it up, I think. And you expect Wizards of the Coast to do a really fantastic job on everything that they put out, because they've got the money, they've got the audience. If anybody can make this stuff work and present it to a really, really high standard, then it's Wizards, and so your expectations are sky high, and it doesn't necessarily follow through. But if you want information on further areas in the realms, then Rime of the Frost Maiden's one. There's another adventure campaign whose name escapes me at the moment, that's all about the Underdark, which I'll be reviewing later on. I mean, this goes to go a little bit more in depth into the specifics of the Sword Coast, so I suppose you could use it alongside the wikis and so on that exist that cover the Forgotten Realms. But in and of itself as a book, it's not hugely essential or useful, and that's a bit of a disappointment, and it doesn't really go into things enough. I mean, it's a retread. 4th edition really fucked up the Forgotten Realms with their revisions of things that were going on there. I guess this redresses the balance a little, but it can't help but be a retread. It's disappointing to see imaginative settings like Dark Sun, Planescape, and so on haven't really been properly redone. Eberron has been, kind of. We'll get to that in a later review. But we could use some new, really interesting and radical settings, and the in-house stuff just really isn't providing that, unfortunately. So it follows the standard sort of format you'd expect. You get an overview and some history of the area. If you're familiar with the Forgotten Realms, it's not hugely useful. Some stuff on currency, calendar, background stuff that doesn't tend to really come up in a lot of games, unfortunately. Because if you want to put that much depth into it, it's all good. Scant information on the Pantheon, but then you can get all that information elsewhere, really. A lot of this is a retread of old information or information you can get from elsewhere. Some of it, how it dies into the changing nature of the realms and so on, which I guess is more useful, but it's mostly a retread. One problem with a lot of the book is that a lot of it is written from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, which is something I used to hate White Wolf for doing. They would do everything from the perspective of a character or characters, and their insight and ideas about what was going on, and that didn't really work, and it buried the useful information. This isn't as guilty of that as White Wolf games were, but it's still pretty guilty of it. Alright, so you got the usual stuff on the locations. Waterdeep, obviously, is a big and well-known location. Again, that's probably why, thinking about it, they choose to retread the Sword Coast over and over again, because it's the areas that people are most used to, I suppose. I've just been complaining in my previous review about the art in Wildermount, which was a bit too cartoonish, but the art here just isn't quite up to standard. It's not very inspiring. There's a lot of very static, bland, washed out pieces of art showing just pieces of equipment, spot filler stuff. Nothing against that, but it's just not particularly inspiring. It doesn't seem to evoke the mood of the realms. It's like they're bored of it, almost. It's just not particularly dynamic. Again, there's not a lot of point going into a huge amount of detail here, because it's all retreads. It's all stuff that's already been covered and recovered in previous supplements. I guess if you want an update or you want to see how things have happened, might be useful, but if you've been playing in the realms for a very long time, doubtless events that your characters have been involved in have changed things in certain ways as well. I didn't spot so many direct ideas for adventure seeds in this book. That just doesn't seem to be as much of a thing. Right, so the Gazetteer, which should be the most interesting sort of segment on it, is really only a fraction of the pages in the book overall. So probably starting from 43 and ending around page 100. So about 60 pages of lore and useful information. Then it's the usual retread stuff. Races shouldn't really particularly need to be gone into because it's pretty much Faerun is the standard for vanilla D&D. You've got a few particular sub races and things which are mildly interesting, I suppose. But Faerun was bog standard vanilla fantasy when bog standard vanilla fantasy was what people wanted. So you can forgive this in a way you can't Wildermount, I suppose. But they do seem to have felt forced to incorporate a lot of the new races and ideas from elsewhere. Excuse me. Somewhat revisionism on the nature of half-orcs, as is to be expected, because the gods of blandness and mediocrity from the real world seem to have invaded Faerun, including Anno Dionysus, god of meh. Unfortunately, then, it follows the standard pattern. You've got race information, class information, a couple of new paths and things that you might be interested in. The Harpers are pretty key to Faerun, so that's useful to have official information on. Not a great deal for a lot of the rest. Fighters, it's always nice to have more options for fighters, more archetypes, more moves and special abilities, and so on. Monks never really fit outside of the Eastern realms. It's just it's so out of place. There were martial orders of monks, but they were not kung fu fighting. They were more like knights. So I don't know. That's the one thing about D&D that always jars for me. Who cares about paladins? So some new, scant new ideas for rangers, and not really a lot in the way of. I don't think there's anything in the way of mechanical differences there, which is a shame. We could do with some more options there. Rogues are pretty important, given the urban nature of some of the aspects of the world here, like Waterdeep and so on. Excuse me, it's not the coof, I promise you. It's just talking too much. New Sorceress Origins, I'm here for that, and for Warlocks. New options there as well, all very useful. So Fey channel power, demonic channel power, weird great old gods. Though no Cthulhu there, unfortunately. Going back to sorcerers for a moment, storm sorcery is an option, which is nice. Wizards guilds and so on. Something missing from 5th edition is really the schools of magic. This doesn't really compensate for that. You can't create a specialist school wizard here, but there's some aspects of the old wizardly orders across Faerun. Some new spells, always nice to have. New backgrounds, again, always nice to have. Most of these you could just pick up and chuck into whatever else you wanted. Crafters, City Watch, obviously those are pretty universal. Cloistered Scholar, pretty universal. Courtier, universal. Faction Agents, you can tweak that for your own setting without too much trouble. Far Traveller's useful. That's another one that can be used anywhere. The only thing I don't particularly think works about the backgrounds is the random roll, but you can avoid that if you want to. Mercenary Veteran, that's obviously one that's good to throw around. Though a level 1 Veteran Mercenary doesn't make a particularly huge amount of sense. There's a brief mention of other worlds and the options from there, so it's set up for you to move across, and that's it really. It's a bit thin on the ground, and that's really the problem with it. I think this at least looks, smells, and sounds like a lore book. It's not an adventure that happens to have lore with it. It sells itself as a lore book, but it's pretty thin. It's not up to the kind of page count of these other bigger books, though they do waste a lot of space. It doesn't have any adventures in it, which from my point of view is good, but then it doesn't use the extra space it could have had if it added some pages to present you with more lore and more universal options. And the art's a bit muddy and lacking and doesn't really evoke the setting particularly well. So I can only give it a 3 for style and a 3 for substance. Again, it's another deeply average book, dragged down by the fact that expectations are high for these big companies to do cool things with their books, and by the sheer weight of history behind the Forgotten Realms and Faerun, and not being a guide to the Forgotten Realms. Honestly, the 3rd edition guide is better if you can find it somewhere, and that's pre getting screwed over by 4th edition. Otherwise, I would honestly just stick to the online wikis and use this as a sort of update and slightly more in-depth guide. And frankly, when you're running a game, typically these days you have a tablet or a laptop with you, and a wiki is a lot easier to reference. So, disappointing. Zang. Said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice, from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.
Disappointment.
And this is not a time to be dismayed. This is punk rock time. This is what Joe Strummer trained you for. It is now time to go. You're a good person. That means more now than ever.